Okay, morning everyone. I think we're going to get started. Sorry, my mic is a bit strange. What can you do? This one's a big one, and there's quite a lot to it, so I would suggest using your textbook as well. We're going to go into some of the issues that rural settlements face, especially, in South Africa, but also in general all around the world. The first thing which you have actually learnt about in grade 10 and beyond and before, and you've learnt about this in social sciences, which is rural-urban migration, and you know that this means people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and you also know there's a lot of reasons for that. You should know why people are moving out, and you should know why people are moving into urban areas as well. And this all gets started on page 185 in the textbook. But that's the basics of this. When we move on, you'll see we're going to drill down into it as well. Now, you've also learned this in social science before, why people are pushed out of rural areas and why they are attracted to urban areas. So the push factors are things that push people out, almost make them leave. And you know that in rural areas this is mainly due to a lack of employment, services that are not great, there's a risk of natural disasters, you get lower wages, and there's usually not a great social life, there's not great economic educational opportunities, there are less, the infrastructure is not great, and there are less services as well. But you are now attracted to the city because the city has what we call a bright lights appeal. There are better job prospects, the lifestyle's a bit better, you might make a bit more money, the infrastructure's nice, there probably will be nicer schools as well. So everyone moving out of the rural area has quite significant effects on the rural areas, which we've never really talked about before. And you can imagine the kind of people who would leave the rural area first. It's people like you, people who are young adults. So the young adults, and predominantly the males, would leave the rural areas, and they would leave behind the grannies and the old grandpas and all people who are too old to actually look after the land. So that leads to the rural area having this old population, or if you look at the population pyramid, it's kind of inverted with very few young people and then all these old people at the top. And that we call selective outward migration, which means not everyone is migrating outwards, only some of the age groups are. And that means that the population in the rural areas goes down, there are less people there spending money on the businesses, so the businesses will shut down, there's less people to work on farms, so maybe some of the other jobs related to farming the jobs evaporate as well. This also means that some of the land in the rural areas gets the land is not as well looked after, property values go down, the government spends less money in these areas because of the low population, and the area basically declines and sets into this decay when people leave, especially the young people. And this is in your book as well, it's taken from your book, and this is called the cycle of rural decay. So the idea is that once you get locked into the cycle, it's very hard for you to get out of this, and you can start basically anywhere on this cycle, but it's pretty much, if you start at say the top 12 o'clock, which means there are some employment challenges in rural areas. A lot of this could be because farms are using more machinery and they're becoming more mechanized, so there's less need for farm workers. So what would happen is that there's less jobs in the rural area. That means young people leave out. The young people leave, they move out, and you can see that the age structure then changes as we go clockwise around this diagram. People have fewer babies, the population goes down, there's less people spending money, so the shops will close down, houses get neglected and land gets abandoned, which means no new money is coming into there's no new businesses opening up, the economy kind of stagnates, and then the cycle repeats itself because there are no jobs. So while people do need a better life and they go in search of that, going to a city, it often results in catastrophic effects for rural areas. they get trapped into the cycle of rural decay, and it's very hard to escape from it. The people who leave, though, the rural migrants who migrate out of the rural area to the city, they face some challenges as well. They often might not have a lot of money when they arrive in a city. You might have faced these big costs from traveling to the city. A lot of people are illiterate. They cannot read or write when they arrive at a city, which limits your job opportunities. They lack information about the city and how things work. They struggle to adapt to this new lifestyle of the big city life. They might be at risk of things like crime or discrimination, and they face challenges in terms of distance with the rest of their family that they've left at home. And that lack of capital at the first run there results in new people who've migrated to the city often not being able to afford decent housing, so they are often forced to live somewhere where housing is cheap, like an informal settlement, which has problems of its own that we will get to. But these are the problems that the new travelers will face when coming to a city from the rural area. This is just a trend we find in the world. So in Southern Africa and much of the developing world, where countries are less economically developed, then we find that there is this rural-urban migration where people are leaving the rural areas to go to the city because of all the pull factors that we learnt about. The city has better job opportunities, better lifestyle, more services, better education and healthcare. But what you find at the bottom of that slide, in more economically developed countries, you're looking at a lot of European countries, some countries in Asia as well, you find the opposite happening. So people are finding that the city is too crowded and too congested and too polluted, and people have the resources to actually move out of the city. So in economically developed countries, you'd find the reverse happening. You would find there being urban-rural migration. So people are actually trying to escape the hustle and bustle and the messy city life, and they actually are attracted to the calm, peaceful rural living. So that's just an interesting trend we find across less LEDCs, the less economically developed countries, and the more economic developed countries. You find the migration is in the opposite direction. Okay, so once you look at the cycle of decay, we must now look at a case study and how to fix it. It's very hard to fix, but a great example of this, it's in your book as well, is Prince Albert, which is a town in the Karoo in South Africa. And Prince Albert was a kind of flourishing town at the end of the turn of the century. So in the early 1900s, things were going well for Prince Albert. They were a well-established ostrich feather producer, but then they also discovered gold as well. The gold mining also brought lots of people to Prince Albert. But then early in the 1900s, this is just after the First World War basically had ended, the ostrich feather market collapsed because people were using kind of synthetic feathers for feather dusters and things like that. Then there was this Great Depression, the worldwide depression in the 1930s, which meant that people didn't have money to invest in the town. The gold mines dried up. Now there was no the main kind of drivers of this town kind of turned off. What that meant, people left. People went. They moved out of the rural area out of the farmlands of the Karoo, and they went to the cities, the bigger cities, for the pull factors like jobs and better prospects. Prince Albert then set into the cycle of decay, where that same cycle we saw, there were less employment opportunities, people left, the businesses closed down, there was less investment in the town, and as a result you got back to the top of the cycle of decay again. Okay, so Prince Albert's a great case study because they were actually able to reverse this, and it's quite important for us to realize that when we look at the cycle of rural decay, we need to know what can you do to reverse this. So the first thing that Prince Albert did is they kind of planned this turnaround strategy. They looked at their resources, and they looked at what they could use. They also looked at what did they need to do. So they needed to make sure that people had services and needs. They needed to make jobs. They needed to give people skills. They needed to they needed to use their natural resources well, and they needed to invest a bit in their infrastructure and make sure that it was in line with what the people needed. And how did they do all these things? It sounds pretty tough, but they spent some time thinking about it. Okay, and what they kind of came up with is to try and meet all those needs. They looked at what opportunities were they. So they saw, sure, we actually have some fairly good arable land. They were able to then grow things. That picture at the top left there is of a fig farm, and they're drying figs in the sun-dried figs. So they started to grow kind of high-value items that the area was capable of doing. So figs, olives. They've got Angoran goats for the goat's wool, for textiles and leather. They also developed a tourism industry. So they looked at museums, and they looked at getting people back through conference centers and bed and breakfasts and little hotels and cycle tours. So they just got people coming there, like festivals. Okay, I've got festivals as well. As part of this, they had to invest a bit in the community as well. So they did come up with ways of, and we'll talk about the land as well, but getting the community involved in projects which would uplift poor residents, and especially the farm workers in the area. They looked at attracting people for arts festivals and kind of music festivals as well to get people in. They fixed up a lot of their national heritage, or their heritage sites and old buildings, and they resurrected a lot of their history, also as a means to get tourists back and to beautify the town a bit. And as one of the many things they also did is they got the commercial farmers in the area to give land to some of the small farmers, the poor farmers, to use, so that the poor farmers could sell the produce at markets and actually make some money. And as part of that, they worked on training people, getting community members jobs, getting people to actually work in some of these new economic opportunities that had opened up. And as a result, nowadays you can Google Prince Albert. It's a fantastic getaway location. You can see these pictures. It looks amazing. They marketed the town very well, and as a result, Prince Albert has now got out of the cycle of rural decay and is now actually a tourist location where people like to go and visit. So that's how they got out of it. They made their plan, these things, which you could do in any town, actually, in any rural area, and they just looked at their strengths and they worked on their strengths. And luckily Prince Albert had these strengths, so this would not apply to all towns. Each town would have to look, each rural area would have to look at their own opportunities and strengths. Alright, so the government of South Africa has a plan of how to get rural areas out of the cycle, or to prevent them from getting into the cycle of rural decay. And the idea is that you want to actually make rural areas attractive for people to stay in. You don't want people to leave the rural areas. You're not forcing them to stay, you just want to make the rural areas a bit more attractive. And the three ways you do that is firstly to reduce your poverty and make sure that people have enough food in the rural areas, there's not malnutrition. The second thing you have to do is make sure that you use and manage your natural resources very well. You should leverage those. And the final one is you actually want the rural area to be nice and vibrant, but it must also be equitable. Equitable means it must not disadvantage anyone. There should be an equal and democratic sharing of resources and services, and also it should be sustainable. Sustainable, means that we are using things in a way that they will not get used up, and that we are preserving things in a way for current generations to use as well as future generations. Okay, so now this is the way. These are the aims of that comprehensive rural development program that the government has. The first aim, which we're going to talk a bit more in detail, is land reform and land redistribution. The second one is there to improve the agricultural production and food security. Now, you remember food security is the principle of us having enough food for our immediate and future needs on a national level, pretty much. So we don't want the country to slide into a position where we don't have food. So we want to make sure that people in rural areas are actually getting their farm production up. The third one on the right, we need to make sure that people have access to transport or transport networks in rural areas. The one on the bottom left, one of the aims, important aims of the Comprehensive Rural Development Program, the CRDP, is to impart skills and training in terms of these agricultural systems, but also things that are not necessarily agricultural. The middle one at the bottom, that's also one of the aims of the CRDP, is to revitalize towns, to make them these vibrant places where people want to live, not places where people are trying to escape from. And then the last one on the right, the bottom right, is to support other activities that are not necessarily farming related. So things like tourism, things like what we call agro-processing, which is turning primary inputs into products for sale, like leather processing or fruit canning or other food processing. So those are the aims of the CRDP. And I said we were going to talk about the land reform. This is an important kind of milestone on the way there. So we need to talk a bit about something called social justice, which we find is often lacking in rural areas in South Africa. So social justice means that you have equitable access to services that give you a better quality of life. Equitable means everyone should have that access, okay? Not just those who can afford it. So these are some of the problems, there's a lot of them, problems that rural areas face. And these are, many of them are actually push factors, right? They're all push factors. So we know if we start at the top, the unemployment, well, we know there are no jobs, that's why people are leaving. And there's no jobs because the area is not well maintained, there are no, well, businesses are closing down, the areas are not pleasant to be in, they're not revitalized, people don't necessarily want to go to rural areas, the quality of life is not great. Rural depopulation is caused by people who now leave, as we talked about. And then on the far right, we've got the social justice issues, and these are services and that are basically rights that everyone needs. They're basic rights, actually: healthcare, water, electricity, education, and housing. So those are things that everyone we should not be withheld or denied access to these things just because we live in a rural area. So we can't be in a situation where we say, oh well, you live in a rural area, now you cannot get educated, or you can't have healthcare, or you can't have housing. Those are things that cannot happen. We must provide those for people. If we continue going clockwise, we talked a bit about lack of capital and lack of investments, which people are not people are not pouring money into rural areas. The lack of services, things like the police services, things like internet, waste disposal, those are services which are not happening in many rural areas. Land reform we'll talk about as well, that is giving people actual rights to live and work on land. The limited infrastructure, we know things like roads, street lights, bridges, drainage systems, those are also lacking in rural areas. Rural areas suffer from soil erosion and overgrazing just because people have limited access to land and also limited space, and they're also maybe have not been educated in sustainable farming methods. Poverty and malnutrition, well, that's what you get when people cannot find employment and people do not have access to nutritious food. The droughts and floods as well is people at risk in rural areas because people might be subsistence farmers, and if you do have a drought or a flood, well, your main food source has now been taken away from you. So these are some of the problems that rural areas face. And part of the challenge is actually providing access to or solving these problems. And solving the problems, if we work on solving those problems, then that's how you impart social justice into rural areas, especially in terms of those 5 services on the right, 5 needs: healthcare, water, electricity, education, and housing. So if you can provide, we need to make sure that we provide those to rural areas so that people's lifestyles can be maintained and people's quality of life can actually be upheld. Okay, so before we get into the land reform, we just need to go into some definitions. The first definition we'll get into is land tenure. So tenure is a word that means your right to the land is very well defined under the law or under whatever's country systems. And if you have land tenure, that means you either have a title deed or you have formal access to land that no one can actually chase you off. So if you have tenure, land tenure, if you own your farm or you have the title deed to a dairy farm, that means legally the land is yours, you cannot be kicked off. If you do not have land tenure, like if you're a farm worker who maybe did not actually own the farm, maybe you were just a seasonal worker, then the farmer could actually at any point kick you off the land and say, this is my farm, you go somewhere else. And this has tragically happened in many parts of South Africa, because farm workers and others don't actually own the land that they have maybe built their house on, so they can get kicked off that land. And the second column there is what is land reform or what is redistribution. So this is when we change the allocation of land, usually farmland, and we allocate that, we give it to disadvantaged and poor people for settlement and farming. And both of these issues are fairly contentious now, they're very political issues, and we're going to get into that as well. But land reform is something that even the ancient Romans had to look at land reform for various reasons as their cities grew. So it's not a new concept. It's just a very tough concept because it's super complex and there are very different scenarios and there's a lot of history involved and it's very hard to actually run. So we're going to look at how it works, and we're also going to look at some of the limitations with the current land reform and land redistribution program in South Africa. Okay, so moving on. So this quote is actually from a very new draft policy that came out, but this is basically the history that we find ourselves living in. And the quote says, a notable number of black South Africans continue to be landless, which means people do not have land, and are excluded from participating in sustainable agriculture and live in unsustainable human settlements without sufficient livelihood resources. So this has persisted from the days of apartheid and before, where black South Africans were dispossessed of land. Now, dispossessed means a white European farmer would come and they'd take your farm. They'd say, this is a nice piece of land, it's mine now. And they would take it and they'd probably kick you off. And they would then they'd take the kind of best fertile arable land, and in most cases the black farmer was left to do whatever. They were left to either work on the farm or get off. And so the land was actually taken away. And since the advent of democracy in South Africa, since '94, the government's been trying to now work on this. Like, how do we now change the land ownership so that it's more equitable, it's more democratic? Because currently, still a lot of the land is still relatively commercial. The agricultural land is these big commercial farms that are the majority of them are white owned. So white people still, even though we're one of the minorities of the country in terms of population, still own a lot of the big farms, and that is what we have to change. Because people need, as you can see at the bottom, that final sentence where final line, they say we need a place to settle, we need a place to live, and also a place to maintain a livelihood. So that means to live, to find food and have means to live and make some money, or at least eat. So I gave you that quote just to show you that it's still a process that's ongoing. We are still trying to work on policies and how to actually carry out land reform in a democratic way. And you will see from the next slide, I think it is, that there are some principles that guide this land reform. But maybe before we get into that, let's talk about how land reform happens in South Africa. So the way it works is, if you have a claim, you can claim land, and you can claim that your ancestors used to live on a section of farmland, and you were then forcibly removed, or you were dispossessed of that land. Maybe the land was culturally, communally owned, but anyway, you apply it to the Department of Agriculture, basically, and you fill in a whole lot of forms, and you have to provide evidence that this land was removed from you, and you have to give testimony, and you have to fill in a bunch of forms, basically, and go through a big process. And the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development will then review your claim, and they will decide if that's legitimate or not. And what we have been following up till now, well, we're still following it in many ways, is a principle called willing buyer, willing seller, which means, let's say you did claim as a black farmer, you claimed that you had been dispossessed of your land. Then the government would notify the owner of the land, the current owner, and say, there's a land claim on your farm, would you like to sell? Would you like to sell your land? And the farmer can say yes or no. And if the farmer says, yes, I will sell my land, then the government will actually buy the land from the farmer. The government will purchase the land, and they will give the title deed, they'll give the ownership of the land to the applicant, whoever applied, the person who was historically dispossessed of that land. So you can either have the land, or you can request a financial compensation. So you can either have the land, or basically the value, a certain value that the department decides of the land. Because many people don't necessarily want to farm, but their land did have value. So you can choose how you want to get compensated from the land reform. So you can imagine that's a lot of forms, and how can you actually prove that your great-great-grandfather's farm was dispossessed, and you have to have maps, and you have to have kind of boundary diagrams to try and prove that the land was yours. So it's actually a very complicated administrative procedure. So it can work if there's a claim on your farm, and the farmer says, sure, I'll sell the land, then the government buys it and gives the land, and it's all good. Whereas if the farmer says, no, I'm not selling, then the whole process stops. So that's part of the problem with land reform, is that it rests on the farmer wanting to sell the land. Okay. So these are the principles of how we deal with land reform in South Africa. These are what we are trying to achieve. So the first principle is that we are trying to de-racialize the rural economy for shared and sustainable growth. So that means we can't have a situation where all the commercial farmers on the big high-earning farms, we can't have that only in the hands of white farmers, and all the little small farms in the hands of black farmers. It should be equitable, okay? It should be democratic and de-racialized. The second one is that we're not only looking at race here, we're looking at gender, we're looking at people with disabilities, we're looking at income group, and race as well. And we want our land allocation to be shared democratically, so that everyone can actually have an opportunity to benefit from South Africa's agricultural land. And then the third one is, while we do all these things, we have to make sure that we are not compromising our national security, our national food security. Okay, so we can't just give away our land and then have people not farming that land, because then we will have no food. We'll have to import food, which will have a massive effect on our GDP. So those are the principles of land reform which we are currently following. And the challenges which I mentioned, so this is a work in progress, right? The Department of Agriculture is constantly engaging with people, talking to experts, talking to agricultural advisors and banks, and trying to figure out how can we carry out these principles. They sound very simple, but they're actually not. They're very hard to do. And part of the process was, well, it's been very slow because some farmers won't sell. It takes a long time to get all your claims together and the forms, and there's like a backlog, so people have claimed years ago and now they're still trying to process these claims, and sales are still going through. It takes a long time to verify if this person actually did, his great-grandfather was actually on that farm or not. People who then receive this land maybe have never farmed it before, and they might not have skills to farm that land. They might not have adequate training to actually be farmers. And there are these serious risks that if we just let the process go uncontrolled, our food security will suffer. So we have to, everything we do must make sure that we still have food in South Africa. And that brings us to the end. So thanks very much, and next time we will move on to chapter 4, where we move on to looking at urban settlements now. Thank you guys.